But I just want to say hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Geneva Macro Labs online talk, Fragile States, What Can Policies Do? My name is Chiara, and I have the pleasure of working with Geneva Macro Labs, supporting the Geneva Impacts Initiative primarily. I'll be moderating this online talk today together with Paul Wang, who will be managing the discussion portion of our event, and as such, he'll be keeping a close eye on our chat. Most of you know the Geneva Macro Labs already. We are a do tank that convenes leading minds from the public and private sectors, as well as civil society, to catalyze measurable impact towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Before we get started, a quick reminder to please mute yourself during this talk. And also, this webinar will be recorded, so you will be able to watch it later and share with your networks. So now I'm delighted to introduce our two guests for this evening. I'd first like to welcome Professor Reem Ayadi. Professor Ayadi is an economist and international expert on inclusive and sustainable socioeconomic models, financial architecture, and stability and sustainable finance. For our talk today, she will be discussing the issue of indebtedness and the need for transparency and governance in fragile states. I would now like to introduce Dr. Ralph Chami. Dr. Chami is currently Assistant Director and Chief of the Financial Policies Division in the Institute for Capacity Development at the International Monetary Fund. And he recently released a book, congratulations, Dr. Chami, called Macroeconomic Policy in Fragile States. And there has been a link where you can find access to this book shared in the chat. And I think Dr. Chami will speak a bit more on this, where you might be able to access this book. And today he will be discussing what is different about the design and implementation of macroeconomic policies in fragile and conflict-affected states. So with that, we can get started. Dr. Chami, may I ask you to please unmute your microphone, and will you be sharing slides today?
I believe the decision is to have a panel discussion, sort of,
okay.
Rather than.
All right.
But, yeah. Thank you so much, Chiara.
Yeah, of course. Please take it away.
Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's good to see my friends Paul and Renata and Eckhart, and of course my good friend Reem on this. So the book basically is a culmination of experience gained from working on fragile states. I myself worked on fragile states for a good 5 years. Started out in surveillance on many states and then ended up being mission chief and division chief for fragile states. And throughout, when you go into this, having been trained in what we call kind of, sort of dynamical systems and theoretical training in asset pricing, because I'm a financial economist working in sort of complete markets or advanced economies. And then you end up just being, plucked out and sent to a work on a fragile state. It's like a jarring, dose of reality. You get to, you look in your toolbox and you very quickly realize that a number of things that you thought would work would not work in such situations. And it really asks you to whether you understand what you're doing and pay attention to where you are. And there are many lessons that hopefully this will come out in the discussion. But the book itself is a culmination of my experience there, along with colleagues from the IMF, from all departments of the IMF, from the World Bank, from renowned experts. Eckhart is one of those people who actually contributed very nicely to the book. We have people from academia, we have people from the policy side, from the research side, but the book is mainly geared not for academic precisely for academic purposes. It's really geared for practitioners, people who want to get into the work on fragile states, and the policy makers who want to understand, what is different about working on fragile state or operating within a fragile state in the design and in the implementation of macro policy. So the book, before we dig into the macro policy, we spend quite a bit of time trying to understand the socioeconomic part of this puzzle. And this is something where we are not trained very well as economists in our graduate work. We just, especially in more recent training that we get, which is highly technical, we don't really get a good appreciation of the political and anthropological and social backgrounds to all the work, or if you like, it's the framework in which economics sits. So, and that's the first thing you have to deal with as a mission chief myself, or an economist working in fragile states, is you get a sort of an appreciation, sometimes on the job learning appreciation in the context in which you're operating. So the book has 20 chapters, spends quite a bit of time on the political economy before we dig into the macro side, fiscal, monetary, financial, all that stuff. And then we look at critical review of IFI's role in fragile states, and we wrap it up with case studies. The last 2 chapters are basically geared for only case studies, both from Middle East and from Africa. So that's in a nutshell what this book is about. I have 2 wonderful colleagues who are my co-editors, Rafael Espinoza at the IMF and Peter Montiel at Williams College, who actually worked with me on this, putting all of these chapters together and writing one narrative around all of the various contributions. So that's the book in a nutshell. I'll stop here and sort of try to get Paul to ask me questions.
And Ralph, you still have like at least 8 or 10 minutes.
Oh, perfect.
Go.
Then let me. Yes, of course.
Go on, please.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing usually people always, the first thing you, as an economist, and you're designing policies, and what is different really about fragile states? And there are many definitions for fragile states, but the workable definition for me, at least as a practitioner, is the inability of the government to provide the basics of public goods. Especially now in terms of the vaccine, the COVID crisis, inability to provide vaccination or to provide relief. It's the failure of the government to provide security, public goods. This is usually the first thing that hits you when you're working on a fragile state. The other part is the fragmentation within the society. You don't get, there's no one cohesive narrative that brings everybody together. You see competing narratives from within the society. And as a result, there's no trust in the government. And if there's no trust in the government, then you can see how it feeds on itself. No trust of the government. You can't do what it wants to do. And it's not able to raise revenue because nobody wants to pay, because nobody thinks that they're going to get anything in return. And it feeds on itself. There's an issue definitely of governance. There's an issue of corruption, but these are not only endemic to fragile states. We see them all over the world, but in particular, in fragile states, they can lead to failure. So one thing we've learned is fragility can be exogenous, can be magnified by exogenous sort of factors, but very much it's endogenous. And that endogeneity is incredibly important to understand. Because if you're a macroeconomist and you're trying to give advice, and let's say you've worked on countries that are not necessarily fragile, and you just use that same tool to give the same advice in a fragile environment, that advice could precipitate in failure of that state. And when I talk about state failure, meaning complete chaos. So let me give you an example. A lot of times we say, well, the public sector is not very efficient. Maybe you should privatize this entity. That could work in an economy that is working pretty well. There's no real signs of fragility per se. But if you try that in a fragile environment, you try to privatize something that is sort of a public system that you want to privatize, thinking that's going to enhance its efficiency, it can have exactly the opposite effect. Because those that can purchase the whatever you're trying to sell, the asset, are the ones who are, linked to the governing body, and that only, makes things worse because it doesn't really increase the efficiency. You're just basically enriching the rich and increasing the dispersion of the wealth, the difference between the rich and the poor, and can only actually reduce the trust in the government. Another example could be that you say, well, your public sector is not very efficient. The wage bill is very high. Why are you giving tenure in the public sector? You should not be having so many people just sitting around doing nothing. Why don't you release them into the labor market? Well, if you were to do that, well, the idea is that you enhance the efficiency, you reduce the inefficiency within the government. Presumably you have in mind that there's some dynamic labor market, and you can release them into the labor market and they would be picked up. That doesn't happen. What you can end up with is more unemployed in a structural situation of unemployment, especially if it's among the youth, and that could precipitate in social upheaval within the country, if not total failure. So what that means is that when you arrive and you're working in these countries, you need to understand that if the fragility is endogenous, you really don't want to aggravate it. So then the question is, what do you do? Well, we'll talk about it hopefully during this panel, is you will end up having to weigh stability versus efficiency, and sometimes you try to bridge the two and choose something that you would not have chosen if you were working on a well-functioning system. Fragility is persistent, and it comes in all sizes. That's the other thing you learn. It's not only low-income countries are the ones who are fragile, but it could also be middle-income countries. I've worked on, thank you, Renata, and I worked on fragile states that were middle income. In fact, I worked on a fragile state, I don't want to name it now. When I first took over as a mission chief, they had in the bank $170 billion. That's okay. So if you're looking at, it's a very rich country. I was mission chief for two countries at the same time. And the other country, I had two screens, one for that country and another screen for the other country. The other one was in arrears to the IMF. And both of them were fragile. So one had lots of money in the bank, one had no money whatsoever, but both were fragile. So the question is, what gives? It's not about having, a rich kind of economy. It's everything else that comes with it. Again, the lack of, issues of governance, issues of, the frameworks are missing, property rights are missing. There's so many different, but it culminates in inability of the government to provide public goods, lack of trust, lack of a common narrative that brings everybody together about, sort of a national identity that kind of allows the government to operate. And of course, sometimes it's aided and abetted by outside factors, could be weather related, could be political, could be other things. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for giving us a little bit of insight on your book, but also for setting the context a bit more about, what is a fragile state? How do states kind of find themselves there? And as you said, sort of what are the differences between, the policies that these states tend to kind of find themselves implementing. So with that, we will now switch over to Professor Reem Ayadi. And just a reminder to the audience that you are free to post your questions in the chat, and we will be addressing them after Professor Ayadi's talk and when we kick off the discussion section. So Professor Ayadi, whenever you're ready, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Thank you very much for inviting me, Eckhart and Renata, for this very, very important topic, which is fragile state and what do we do to manage the fragile state, particularly in amidst COVID-19 and a global pandemic. I think, of course, the situation of the fragile states, whatever these are, wherever these are, is exacerbated with the global pandemic. And I'm extremely happy to be at the same panel with my dear friend Ralph, after listening to his very beautiful music and also very comprehensive view on fragile state, based on his book, which I'm still hoping to read, and hopefully I will read in I don't know if during holidays or not, but for sure I will end up reading. So my comments really related to something quite, I would say, symptomatic to fragile state, which is over-indebtedness, in a way, lack of governance, and also the lack of transparency. The region where we're working within the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association is so South and East Mediterranean and Africa, where it's not by luck that these regions of the world, they host most of the fragile states. And if we look at what fragile states are worldwide. So if I dig a bit into this aspect of over-indebtedness of these fragile states, we can see also that generally those countries, they lack transparency, and their institutional setting is rather weak, and their governance, it's also rather problematic if we make a certain assessment. Now, I would like to go a bit broader and then look at what the OECD report, which was published in 2020, about states of fragility during the COVID-19. And also this report recognizes the severe reality of fragility in its multidimensionality and complexity. The concept of fragility is very complex. When a country goes into a path of fragility, it touches also the conditions for failure. And many of those fragile states, they touch the path of failure. So this report has defined fragility as the combination of exposure to risk in 5 areas: economic, environmental, political, social, and security overall. And it is also the insufficient capacity of the state or system overall to manage, absorb, and mitigate those risks. It's practically, we can make a parallel with a bank that is in a way failing to manage its overall risks and portfolios. Now, the health crisis has largely impacted the income security, health, education worldwide, and exacerbated the political and socioeconomic situation in those between fragile states. And then if we look at the estimates based on the data 2020, we see that 23% of the world population and 77 of those qualified before COVID-19 as extremely poor live in fragile contexts. So these numbers are really quite increasing. And in the Mediterranean and Africa, this situation is quite exacerbated. And in my view, we need to reassess which are the countries that are fragile nowadays after COVID-19. And we might see that those countries that are qualified as fragile, maybe even failing or in the brink or the brink of failing, they might even increase. So how to deal with growing fragile state worldwide must be really on the top of the agenda of the G20 in Italy this year, and how to exit or how to pull those fragile states from a failure path to a resilience and growth path. So let me dive a bit into what I think it's a key determinant of fragility in these countries, which is for me over-indebtedness, capacity of, in fact, it's in the non-cap or incapacity of those countries to service their debt and to pay their past debt with issuing newer debt. And this is a big problem because it's a kind of trying to ask the market or the creditors, public creditors, to fund their models. And this is completely unsustainable and brings those countries into the path of failure. And many countries, and I repeat, in the Mediterranean and also in Africa are going into this direction during the COVID-19. So I'm not going too much onto what I call the ongoing development, where many countries are going into with this wave of debt, either developing countries are also developed countries. But then if we look at the developed countries, they have the capacity to indebt themselves, because generally the macroeconomic conditions are still benign, because interest rates are rather low and risk premia also are rather low for developed countries. But then for developing countries, the situation is getting under stress and distress. In reality, if we look at some cases like Zambia, Argentina, or maybe also others in Africa and Middle East, they are really touching the red lines and being also downgraded by credit rating agencies. So it means that they are going slowly but surely into the failure path. Now, when we look at what the International Monetary Fund and other international organizations have been trying to do over the years, it's really to push those countries into what we call sustainability path and better macroeconomic management. And we can see that even the IMF and the World Bank have been both pushing for reforming the international debt architecture. Of course, focusing on three elements. One of them, for example, is more debt relief, which is it is happening via the DSSI initiative of the World Bank. Also to strengthen certain contractual provisions via the extension of the collective action clauses, for example, to non-bonded debts. And this is also enhanced by clauses that lower debt payment or automatically suspend debt services during distressed situation. But this is one solution. But one key element is to enhance debt transparency, to facilitate restructuring and resolution decisions and action, but also to put the country into a path of debt sustainability, and hence this is a pillar for better macroeconomic management. So I think it is important to also mention that before the pandemic, this data on sovereign debt has been quite scarce. As an academic, we have been really trying to collect as much data as possible, but still, I think this data need to be enhanced and made more comprehensive by the international organizations. If we look at a recent study, in fact, by the Center for Global Development, March 2021, just they were diving into 100 debt contracts between China and foreign governments. Foreign government, for example, in countries like in Africa or Middle East and so on. And the main result was the prevalence of the confidentiality clause, requiring debtors not to disclose the terms of the contract. This is essential. So if you have this confidentiality clause, it's very difficult to allow this type of debt to be there in the market, to be able to be assessed carefully. So, of course, I mentioned already the DSSI, which is the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which is also pushing these countries to probably trying to help them in terms of debt relief, but at the same time, asking them to be much more transparent in terms of the debt accumulation over time. But then if we look, for example, at the list of countries eligible to under the DSSI, we can clearly see that the majority of them could qualify as fragile state, and I'm confident that more of those countries will be added to the list over time. And they are also into the path of becoming fragile and even into the path to become to fail. Now, I think I want to emphasize one element, which is the participation of the private creditors in the debt relief effort. The private creditors have been rather reluctant to participate massively to this effort because of the lack of transparency and also the lack of trust by the private creditors that they could help and then later on maybe push those countries into a better path for transparency and sustainability. So why debt transparency matters? It's first of all, it is essential for prudent debt management, limiting endemic corruption, and the destruction also of economic value, particularly when there is restructuring and default situation. So when a country is moving from a situation of fragility to a situation of failure. It is a matter of central importance as well in terms of public governance, debt sustainability, debt accountability, and incentives realignment. So more debt transparency will allow creditors, like for example, the Club of Paris, World Bank, IMF, and other private creditors to monitor and guide those countries in the path of debt sustainability and good macroeconomic management. Obviously, this happens if all creditors, including China, Russia, and others, abide to the same rules when they lend to fragile states. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have different countries really applying different rules and allowing other countries, which are the fragile ones, the vulnerable ones, to accept certain conditions which should not be accepted otherwise. We have proposed a solution last year to the G20, T20, is to implement a public interest global mechanism for the recording of old and new sovereign debt issues to boost global debt transparency. So this mechanism should be independent, open access to everybody, means to academics, to civil society organization, and also real-time tech-driven. So using a kind of new technologies like blockchain or distributed ledgers. I think this is also something that could be explored over time. So also our proposal was to require to register new debt issuance by private creditors and should be a condition for no subordination in the event of default and restructuring to better align the incentives. And I think this also will help these countries to improve a certain way their risk premium when they go to the market to ask for liquidity. So this is one proposal we made, and I'm quite happy that the OECD is currently working on some of the aspects of this platform. And I think this platform maybe one day will see the light. So this is pretty much my comment, and I'm happy to discuss the proposals during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem, for that really, really insightful kind of introduction to the issue of indebtedness specifically. And I'm not going to hijack Paul's question and answer session, but I would be very interested to hear how, for example, I mean, your talk was very much focused on the issue of indebtedness and how that is related to fragility. And in Ralph's talk, he made this point about these two states where, you know, one was indebted or had a lot of debt and the other didn't. And there was a kind of, they were both considered fragile. So I would just like to hear Ralph's kind of explanation on how that might happen. But having said that, I will now hand it over to Paul, who will be moderating the discussion section of this event. So thank you to both of the speakers, and Paul, the stage is yours.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Reem, for your insightful speech. There are a number of questions that raised through the chat, as well as other questions. So the first questions that Renate was asking to Ralph, given that fragile states are different in their own ways, what, in your opinion, are the policies prescriptions in this case?
So there are policy prescriptions for the states, but there's also things that people that want to work with these states to help them out, they should understand. For example, when we talk about, I stole that line from Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. Every fragile state is fragile in its own way. I was referring to his, from that famous book, every happy family, they all look, all happy families look alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So I was using it in this one, every fragile state is fragile in its own way. It's recognizing that there's no cookie cutter approach. That's the danger for us, you know, working in these countries. I mean, I've been at the IMF for 23 years. You see your share, and you want to, you usually get this knee-jerk reaction. I've seen the situation here. Maybe I can apply it here. Fragile. When we say countries are fragile, they're fragile. Yes, so they have characteristics that you observe that. You know, for example, in the Reem is presenting a case where you see high levels of indebtedness. And you know, that could be a symptom of the fragility, but is it really the cause of the fragility? It can add to the fragility, it can make it worse, but is it really the symptom? Or is the symptom of it is the corruption and maybe lack of governance? That is weak governance, that basically, you know, the guys in charge have amassed all that debt, but that, you know, I mean, you can amass debt and to invest in your infrastructure. You can amass debt to do, you know, provide better public services, but to amass debt for purely consumption of the government, and you know, sort of, then that you have a problem with that. That in of itself may not be the problem itself, but if you embark on an infrastructure for your whole country and you amass debt, but okay, presumably the infrastructure will increase the productivity, and over time, you know, you may be able to pay back. But if you're going to amass the debt in order because you're increasing consumption of purely, you know, sort of not related to productivity, then you have an issue. So one is recognizing what is that source of fragility. In some countries, you have fractions. You know, society is fractioned. There are too many, you know, sort of groups, and no common narrative and no trust. Okay, and so how this is different than the case of a country which is not too many factions fighting each other, but on the other hand, it has a high level of debt. So that's one. The other one the other thing that you need to recognize is that not only every state is fragile in its own way, but you have to give advice. If anybody is listening, we have a tendency ourselves when we are hired as consultants or IFIs come in, is you come in and you've looked at the situation and you're approaching it as from a social planner's point of view. Meaning you ought to do this. You go into a meeting. I've made that mistake myself, and I call it proselytize. You start saying you ought to do this. Question is the guy on the other side of the table listening to you? Or even if he or she listening to you, can they do anything about what you're prescribing? Because as a social planner, you're solving for the first best, but the first best may not be there. And you can't allow that to stop you from dealing with what's on the ground. So sometimes you end up saying, well, you know, I came in and I gave him advice and I got on a plane and went back. Question is, did that advice resonate with the people on the ground? Is it feasible? It's preferable, but is it feasible? And that is something that, you know, you get to learn this stuff. Unfortunately for me, I learned it on the ground as part of my experience in the field, but it's not something that I was prepped for, because you confuse what's preferred, what is Pareto optimal in the language of or Pareto superior, but it does not apply in the situation that you are in, and you have to be and for example, you say, well, you ought to have this institution. Why? Because this is the good prescription. But maybe they don't have this institution, but maybe the country has a similar institution that does similar work. Why don't you work with it? So one lesson you learn is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Do the best that you can with what you have. The other lesson that you learn is fragile states. Fragility means high turnover and a possibility of failure in the short term. So we have a tendency when we give advice is to say, well, in the medium term, in the long term. I mean, Reem is talking about sustainability. Sustainability is a long-term, medium-term to long-term concept. But for many of these states, they may not, there's no possibility of a medium-term, short or long-term if they don't deal with the short-term. They have short-term needs, and those needs could precipitate in failure. So if I were to go in and start talking, well, in the medium term, you know, this, these guys aren't listening to you. you're listening to yourself and you put it in your report and you go back home and you say, well, I did my job. Well, you actually didn't. You made things worse because they have to survive the short term. And what you want them to avoid is not to implement long-term solutions for short-term problems. Short-term problems warrant short-term, solutions. But in many of these countries, the short-term pressures are so grave that you find that the government in question or the authority in question just want to deal with it, and they implement long-term solutions. For example, you could say, well, due to the conflict, I have a lot of young people who are not being able to find jobs, okay, and that's pressure on me, so I hire them into the civil service. Well, that's a long-term solution to possibly a short-term problem due to the conflict. But what you've done now, you've locked yourself in perpetuity in a high, paying, your wage bill now has skyrocketed. And for people that are not maybe well equipped to do the job that you hired them for, but you just basically want to do away with the pressure. The other thing is you find out in fragile states is whom are you really talking to? In many cases, it's a caretaker government, meaning it's a government that can't even make decisions for itself. Why? And I've had this firsthand in the sense that the person that's supposed to take a decision knows that they're in their job for a few months. So they're not going to take any decision, even if they know you're right. Why? Because they are worried that once they lose that position, that they don't get lined up and shot by the next party that shows up and says, oh, you agreed to this? You're a traitor. So I had ministers tell me, look, I know you're right, but I'm not going to sign on to this because I'm worried I'm only here for a few months. So fragile states, it has a different dynamics that you need to understand, that countries have their own timeline. Your timeline as an advisor giving advice may not accord with that timeline. And what should trump is their timeline, not your timeline. So one of the things we stress in the book is what I call sustained and patient engagement, meaning you may have to repeat the same message again and again and again until the people on the ground own it. And it happened to me many times. I would say it to one minister. Next time I show up is a new minister. And the new minister would tell me, what did the other guy, you and him talk about? And I would have to repeat the same thing. And then by the time I come back again, a third minister has shown up. And he's completely clueless as to what was discussed before. So you may have to, so you end up, as me being the mission chief in my case, you end up being the person who knows the history of the discourse. And that's a privileged position to be in. That's a privilege, and you have to understand. So you need to be patient. You need to keep giving the same advice. Now, the fourth thing that is very important is, the timing of the country, the repetition of the same message again and again, and being patient, and that the person giving the advice, the team, in our case, giving the advice in that fragile states, is maintained, because the authorities in fragile states, it takes them time to develop that trust in whoever is giving advice. And they need to understand that that team is not, changed overnight with a new team that gets to learn at the expense of the fragile states. That is not right. One of the most important lessons that I learned is what Paul Collier has a chapter in our book from Oxford. He calls it the pivotal moment, meaning there's a level of social learning that the country has to reach before change can happen. So let's make it more practical. You arrive in a country and you want to give advice. Now, the country, as Reem is saying, is highly indebted, but let's say it's highly indebted because of corruption. So now I arrive in the country and I want to implement a fiscal solution, okay? Now, who am I dealing with? The same corrupt group that led to that high level of indebtedness. So what am I going to do? Am I going to reduce their debt, restructure their debt? What assures me there's no moral hazard problem, that the same guys who got the country in trouble will actually use any space that you give them to increase their indebtedness. In fact, any debt forgiveness in this case will only empower them to engage in more corrupt behavior. Why is that? Because as Paul puts it in his chapter, there's no recognition of a mistake made. That's the pivotal moment, a moment in time where either a new regime comes in that atones, that basically says, okay, we made a mistake, that accepts the responsibility for the mistakes. You don't find that often. You find the same group of people negotiating with you again and again, and you're thinking, okay, now we're going to do debt restructuring, but what assures me? Oh, conditionality. Well, really, this conditionality, it's with the same people that lied to you before, they're going to lie to you again. So that pivotal moment that Paul talks about is about having either a new regime or the society has reached the point where it's ready for change. But then you need the proof that it is a pivotal moment. You need proof. It's just not a word that you kind of, and there are certain things that you can basically try to hang your hat on to ensure that am I dealing with a new regime, a new crop of people who recognize there's mistakes being made at the government level and they own it. Not just say, well, it's his fault or her fault, not my fault. No, it's our fault. We made a mistake. And this is why we made a mistake. And they have to come clean. That's the transparency side of it. Okay. And then you have to do certain steps that will ensure that what you're talking about is real and not just all talk. Anything else you do in a situation of corruption like this is a waste of money. Any debt restructuring you're doing is just basically providing more ample ammunition for more engagement in moral hazard behavior to the detriment of the country itself.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I mean, you're making the right point about the new regime, the implementation of new regime, or a pivotal moment, or for the government to recognize their mistakes. And that leads actually to another question which I had, and which also Renata had. What are, to actually Dr. Reem, in order for those governments to recognize their mistakes, what are the different types of incentives for governments in fragile states to enhance transparency and also eliminate corruption? Because we all know, I mean, for a corrupted country to recognize their mistakes, it's just impossible. To implement a new regime in a pivotal moment, that takes usually ages, because you can't change, I mean, you can't change the government apart from actually ensuring or initiating a coup d'etat. And so that's why what, in your opinion, Reem, the incentives are to enhance transparency?
Yeah, recognizing mistakes, particularly when most probably, as I mentioned in my comment, the fragility problem is multidimensional and very complex. And when you are in a government, there are many actors there. So the mistake, it's not, it's shared by all of the members of the government and the ministries and whoever is taking the decision. So it's very difficult to point on one institution or a government as a whole, because that's a bit wishful thinking. They will come to their people who voted them and say, hi guys, we made a mistake, right? So especially in democracies. So now in autocracies and dictatorships, this is a bit different. Then they will never recognize mistakes because they say, no, we're doing great. And then they will find ways to do it. And I have a third point, which is all these countries that we're talking about are sovereign states. So they have their sovereignty, and they don't accept it easily to have international organizations or whatever coming to them and tell them what they have to do. So this is also another aspect which is linked, as I mentioned, it is again a very complex aspect of the fragility. And it also linked, we did some research on path dependence. And this is also linked to the histories of these countries, for example, in Africa, which were, so this is all historical aspects which have to be taken into consideration. So how to enhance the incentives for government that have the characteristics of fragile states to enhance transparency? And for me, transparency is the first step to recognize that things have been done in a certain manner, which is not the appropriate manner. So when you go into a transparency path, you are providing evidence. It's evidence-based. It's not only about rhetorics and about presumptions. It's about evidence. For me, at least from my opinion, enhancing transparency specifically on the case of debt is important. First of all, to identify what is the debt stock that the country has, because sometimes you have different governments, and some governments, they are indebting the countries, and the other part, the other governments, the elected government, they don't even know how much the others have indebted itself. So it's very complicated. And then it's also important to know what are the monetary needs to service this debt and how this debt is structured. Sometimes there are certain countries which might be into a restructuring case, and they don't know what type of even debt and who are the creditors and so on. So this is important. And I see practically three reasons for this type of states to enhance transparency, at least on the debt side. First of all, to give more certainty on the debt stock and flows, which also gives the right signal to the market and to other creditors. I think this is also a good signal that could also have a positive impact on overall risk premium. So everybody talks about why those countries, they have such a high risk premium. It's because things are not working properly. Now, if you give the right amount of information and the correct amount of information, then most probably others can assess it, and then this could be eventually reducing your probability of default. Now, second, it's also a kind of a control of the overall stock of public debt via more transparency. And also I would want to emphasize on the role of education and management over time. Because what you want is to move these countries from a fragility and probably failure path to a resilient and development and growth path. Okay, this will also help the country to exit from poverty and solve the problem of inequality and unemployment, specifically for the youth and other groups. The third point is, for democratic countries that function, transparency in debt will also help those those governments to continue the path for development and growth without having to recourse to the witch hunting of the previous government. I think this is also important, because this is much more dissipating the already scarce resources they have. Instead of really fighting themselves, they all normally spend 1 year. I've been studying some African countries, and instead of really going to the right path and trying to really develop, no, they are fighting because you indebted the country more, you were corrupt, etc., etc. So these are all things that eventually will be saved in a certain manner. So this is why this could be also interesting for them to collect further votes, in the next rounds, when there are, of course, democracies.
Thank you very much, Reem. There's a question from Patrick Flynn related to addressed to Reem. Patrick, can you unmute yourself and ask the question, please?
Sure. Hi, I hope you can hear me. So yeah, Reem, just a suggestion, and I'm sure you've been over this topic before, but is there a possibility that funds or restructured debt or even incentives for private investors to raise money for fragile states, that they can ring fence the governance of projects that are allocated to these funds? It just could make those projects more appealing to more available investors, not just sovereign debt.
So you're talking about infrastructure development or?
More infrastructure development or structural reforms, projects that would, improve the country's chances of becoming more resilient, as you say.
So you mean ring fencing? It means that they manage the funds raised, or how do you?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe the IMF takes a governance role in the project. I mean, to what extent they control the project? I mean, I don't know how. I don't know how far I can argue that they control the whole project. I imagine that would be very difficult, but but maybe that they control the governance side of the project.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
The whole discussion about transparency, it's also to monitor the use of the proceeds raised in a debt transaction, for example, either private or public. So it means that when countries borrow, they have to borrow for something, not only for just budgetary support. They need to provide a clear view on which are the projects they want to fund. And then obviously it is, in my view, better to have the monitoring of the use of the proceeds of this debt by third parties, international reputable third parties. Then it is much easier to know where the funds have been allocated and whether the processes have been market oriented or not. Of course, we are very far from this in those type of countries. And this is what makes also, I don't know, perhaps what exacerbates their fragility, because sometimes they borrow and they continue borrowing, but then we don't see there is a multiplier effect in terms of infrastructure development. So clearly, projects, I mean, they need, the way it's to ring fence for specific infrastructure development, and then having third parties, could be international organizations or even audit firms, internationally reputable audit firms that could be monitoring the use of these proceeds and then providing the information on the use of this debt to the market. And this is one of the purposes of this public repository that I proposed in my speech.
Okay, thank you very much, Reem. So we're concluding very soon. So thank you very much, Reem and Ralph, for your insightful and inspiring thoughts, as well as recommendations how to envision changes that you propose to help incentivize the fragile states and also deploying the macroeconomic policy in these fragile states. Now, to both of you, can you, within 30 seconds, just to provide a final statement about anything that could even help us, like developing countries, to help the fragile states?
I mean, I'll try to do it within 30 seconds, but
Thank you.
COVID presents a very interesting dynamic, a very dangerous dynamic, in the sense that it's a global shock. So if you are fragile, you're even more fragile. And if you are not even fragile, you may find yourself to be fragile. And if you're fragile, either you are more fragile or you actually can lead into failure. And I don't want to name countries here, but I think we know some that are on the verge of failure if they haven't failed already. So the list of fragility will only increase. Now, typically, as a macroeconomist, when you have a country that has a shock, gets, in terms of trade shock, you would say, well, you know what, your exchange rate has depreciated. So in the short run, you're going to see your domestic absorption is going to shrink. But over the medium term, your exchange rate becomes more competitive. It's less appreciates, it depreciates, or you may have to devalue. And if you're a touristic country, you'll get more tourists in because you're cheaper, or your exports are going to be cheaper, and therefore you may gain some advantage in the long run, which you can capitalize on. That's a typical advice for a country that faces an idiosyncratic shock.
Okay.
This advice does not work in this case.
Yeah. Okay.
Because this is a global shock. We're all in it together. So your exchange rate will depreciate. You may have to devalue. Your debt levels will rise, but guess what? You can't get out of it by exporting more goods or accepting more tourists. Why? because the rest of the world is in the same predicament as you are. And if you're a tourist country, either they won't come to see you because they don't have the money to come, or because they're worried about COVID. So they're not going to come to your country. So the question is, what do we do? Because this is a global shock. The answer is, we have to understand, all of us, we're all tied together in one belt, and it's called belt of humanity. It ties us all together. So you cannot say, I'm going to look after myself and not look after the country's fragile states because I'm in it for myself. No, because who are you going to sell to? Because those fragile states don't recuperate. You can't sell your products to them. And you cannot go vacation there either. So
it's a global ecosystem.
It's exactly. We're all connected. And if the weakest among us aren't able to come out of this, we, the stronger of the group, are not going to come out of this.
Correct.
Even if you inoculate all of your people in your country, if the guys in the more fragile environment and more populous environment are not also vaccinated and they're getting better, who are you going to sell to and where are you going to go on vacation? So humanity bonds us together, and the economics says we better provide all the assistance that they need to get them out of their predicament as soon as possible.
All right. Thank you very much, Ralph, for your 35 seconds of final statement. Reem, your final statements?
I'll try to make it in less than 30 seconds. So
It's okay.
So align with what Ralph said, the global pandemic can offer a great opportunity for increasingly fragile states to go into a recovery, development, and growth path via enhancing transparency. And we start with debt. That's it.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you very much, everyone. I collected a number of other questions. So what I suggest is that those questions can be asked separately to both Ralph and Reem, and eventually being published on the website of the conference. That could be one possibility, or you can address your questions directly to both Ralph and Reem.
We're more than happy.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll give the floor back to Chiara.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much, Ralph and Reem, for that discussion that we had. I wish we could go longer because, I mean, there are a few more questions, as Paul pointed out, and I'm very interested in this discussion. So thank you again. Before we close for today, let me quickly share my screen. I would like to draw your attention to our conference on AI and talent management, which is happening next week, Thursday, June the 3rd, from 4 to 7 p.m. CET. If you have not registered yet, please do. It's going to be an excellent interactive event that will be exploring the future of work and how it may be impacted by artificial intelligence. And I think Renata will be sharing a link to the website if she hasn't yet in the chat. And finally, please stay in touch with us. You can see the different channels where you can find us on the screen and in the chat. Please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us feedback on our webinar, comment on our posts on LinkedIn, and discuss with us. And if you want to become a member of the Geneva Macro Labs, please use the link posted in the chat a few minutes ago by Renata. And that was it. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers. Thank you to the audience for joining and for sharing your questions. And I wish all of you a pleasant rest of the week. Stay healthy, and we will talk again soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.